Have you seen what's going on at the southern border of the United States? Thousands of people, not only from Latin America, but from all over the world, are pouring across the border every week. This flood of people has caused not only an enormous burden on our infrastructure and economy, but it's fostered a huge debate in our country about whether this should be allowed or not. And I believe the problem is reaching a crisis point. In the late winter, early spring of 2024, the state of Texas has acted to stop the flow of people across its border with Mexico by erecting barriers where people are coming in. In reaction, the United States Supreme Court has ruled that the current administration, whose policy seems to be to open the borders, does have the right to order Border Patrol officials to remove the barriers and barbed wire placed there by the state of Texas. In response to that directive, the governor of Texas has decided to defy the Supreme Court by preventing the Border Patrol from access to the barriers placed there by Texas.
A showdown at the U.S. southern border between local authorities in Texas and the federal government over how to handle the influx of migrants.
We're here under the governor's order in order to protect Texas.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott continuing what's known as Operation Lone Star, a nearly 3-year-old initiative to deter migrants from illegally crossing into the U.S.
At this point, it's unclear which side of this controversy will prevail. My guess is that this conflict will be tied up in legal systems for some time and maybe resolved one way or the other in the national election coming up later this year. And just a few years ago, no one would have foreseen a state defying an order by the highest court in the nation. Be that as it may, I believe that the American border crisis is just one symptom of a much larger issue. This larger issue has affected policy decisions in education, in the corporate world, in healthcare, etc. It has affected issues related to the right to demonstrate and protest by groups all across the political spectrum. And this larger issue is far wider than the United States. We've seen similar issues crop up in nations like Canada, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the list goes on and on. What is at stake here is not about immigration policy or any of the other pressing issues that face us. It has to do with who should have control over the lives of individual people. At this point, what I'm talking about may not seem like a religious issue. So why is someone like me, who runs a Christian nonprofit organization called Aspect Ministries, commenting on it at all? Well, I'm speaking to this issue because I believe that it actually is a fundamental issue that the Bible speaks to. No, the Bible doesn't directly speak about the United States southern border. It doesn't speak about COVID mandates or any of the policies related to one kind of social issue or another. But it does speak to the issue of who should rightfully control the actions, thoughts, and conscience of an individual person. That's what I want to focus on. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you will know that my preference is to present the big picture and then try to boil it down to the essentials of what the Bible actually says. So here goes. On the one hand, the Bible certainly commands that Christians and others should obey their lawful governments. The New Testament book of Romans, chapter 13, is very clear about that. Even more, Romans 13 makes it clear that Christians are not necessarily allowed to disregard the laws and regulations just because a government is unjust. You might recall that the book of Romans was written to Christians living under the Roman Empire, which could be very unjust. In many ways, it was cruel, it favored the rich, it was oppressive, and it was a huge slave society. Gangs and gangs of slaves were used all throughout the Roman Empire. And remember, their slavery was not race-based. Romans slaved anyone who defied the system. And yet Christians were told to obey the laws because laws are there to regulate society, to keep things running smoothly. On the other hand, after the execution of Jesus and his resurrection, the apostles, that would be Peter, James, John, and others, were arrested and brought before the Jewish ruling council. They were called to account for spreading the message about Jesus. That council, called the Sanhedrin, had legal jurisdiction over the Jewish people in terms of religious matters. And this lawful body commanded the apostles to stop preaching and teaching about Jesus Christ. The apostles' reply was basically that the Sanhedrin did not have the authority to command such a thing. So the apostles defied their order because God had the higher authority and had commanded them to preach. In other words, they disregarded what the earthly authority commanded in favor of doing what they believed that God had told them to do. So the Bible teaches that on a certain level, human governments do have the right to regulate society and people's behavior in order to keep society from being chaotic. And that holds true until they violate God's higher laws and will. So how do we work this out in our own times? Well, it seems to me that when civil government regulates things that do not conflict with God's direct will, citizens are bound to obey. Again, because it's necessary in order for people to live peaceably and in reasonable harmony. However, when the government contradicts what God has clearly said, people have a right to disregard what the government mandates. Why? Obviously because governments can be evil. They can be anti-God. I don't think there should be any question about that in anybody's mind, whether we're talking about a current government or one in the past. Slavery is an example. The African slave trade was perfectly legal for a long time, not only in the United States, but many other countries as well. Brazil is a prime example. And yet few today would disagree that it was morally wrong. It was against God's higher law. So people had every right to resist that and overturn that legal structure. Think about Nazi Germany. There were things about the Nazi-run German government that were blatantly against God's will. And there were a few within Germany who tried to resist those things because they knew that their ultimate allegiance was to God, not the government. Many of them paid dearly for that, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for instance. Or go back in the Middle Ages. All over Europe, there was a class of people called the nobility or the aristocracy who made laws, policies, and rules in order to protect their own status and privileges. The people below them, free commoners and peasants, were made subject to some level of control and were limited in what they could do and what they could aspire to. In these cases and many more, we have seen the oppressive rule of a very small group of elites over the masses of people. So how do we apply the principle of living in a regulated society, but under the overall authority of God, with the many issues that we are facing today? Now, we can debate the individual issues all day long, but it just becomes contentious and divisive unless we realize that there's a higher principle at stake. The real issue is, are we okay with being controlled by other people? People whose driving motivation is often for their own advancement, their own enrichment, their own well-being at the expense of everyone else. Or do we refuse to allow such people to subject us to their mandates, their rules, their sometimes random and changeable policies? And I would think that most people would opt for the latter. Yet I have been shocked that people often are willing to trade away their freedom of thought and choice in exchange for stability and peace. That's why scare tactics on the part of elites are so effective. Convince people that they're in danger, and then offer a solution in exchange for control over their lives. In the end, even the stability people bargained for is taken away. And much of my professional life has been in the Christian church. And I see this phenomenon there too. As long as things look good on Sunday morning and programs run smoothly, many Christians are willing to overlook abuses, breaches of ethics, double standards, and just accept what leaders tell them. In recent years, that complacency has led to many shameful scandals in the Christian world. But here's the rub. How do we decide when a government or group of ruling people have overstepped their boundaries? How do we determine when they're not working for the good of those that they govern? When do we reach the point at which we say that we are not going to obey certain mandates and rules? That's the trick, isn't it? We have an example of such a tipping point in the United States Declaration of Independence. In that foundational document, Thomas Jefferson argues that the British government of his day had reached a place where the ruling elites were not working for the benefit of the people in the colonies. They had put their own interests above the welfare of the people. They were not willing to hear from or allow the people any significant input into their own governance. Instead, there had been a long series of abuses and injustices. That's his basic argument. He goes on to explain that because of those levels of corruption, arrogance, and abuse, the American colonists had the right, in fact the duty, to set that government aside and establish a better one. So I ask you, and especially my fellow Christians, look around. Have we reached that point? Have those who have ruled over us for quite some time now, regardless of party or politics, forfeited our obedience, cooperation, and allegiance? Now, I'm not going to make this decision for you. It's very personal. I'm not even going to tell you what my decision is because it's personal for me too. But I am asking you, look at what's happening. At what point do we have the right and the duty to fundamentally change things, as Thomas Jefferson wrote about? At what point do we have the right to disregard rulings that don't make practical sense, as the state of Texas seems to be doing at the southern border? And even before we reach that point, when do we wake up, start thinking for ourselves, and making our own decisions? Now, I certainly don't want to be accused of fomenting violence or some kind of anarchy. I'd be the last one to recommend chaos or insurrection against the government of the country that I love. So don't misunderstand me. I am not calling for that. What I'm trying to do is raise a fundamental issue. We are not always bound to obey laws just because people in authority mandate something. This is not a conservative or liberal issue. And from an American perspective, this isn't a Democrat versus Republican issue. It's about personal freedom of thought, choice, and conscience. And it's reaching what looks to me like critical mass. I would hate to see our country descend into chaos. But on the other hand, I would hate to see our country ruled by an elite who use whatever means of coercion, including deadly force, to maintain their own power and their own policies at the expense of everyone else. Each one of us has to make up our own minds. My purpose in this video is simply to clarify the issues. God bless you. This is Dr. Michael Bogart with Aspect Ministries. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel and watch many of my other videos on all kinds of subjects related to the Bible and Christian living and just life in general for everybody. See you then.